All right. Good morning, good afternoon, and evening. It's evening here. Pujita and I we live very close to each other, like 5 minutes walk from where I live. Welcome everyone. We have right now almost 40 people. Um, Welcome to ARC's lecture series. Today we have with us Pujita Guha, my colleague from UC Santa Barbara. Before we introduce Pujita and her lecture topic of the day, I would like to share a few words about ARC, Advanced Research Consortium Library and Archives, which is based in Imphal in Manipur. Um, ARC became a public library and archive way back in 2022. It's home to a lot of books, a book collection that we upgrade from time to time, and also manuscripts which are as old as 15th century. So for a lot of historians and archivists, this place is really a paradise. And in fact, it's very often visited by a lot of researchers, not only from Manipur, but from outside Manipur as well as abroad. ARC is also a hub of not just traditional scholars and intellectuals, but also a lot of performers and other artists, visuals, dance, theaters, and so on and so forth. Today, my name is Maisna Marapal. I'm a member of ARC, and today I have with us Cyrus Kamukcham as my co-host. A few words about Cyrus. Cyrus completed his master's in English from Delhi University and is also a grantee, the Zuban Sasakawa Peace Foundation Grant 2024-2025. Cyrus is also an upcoming Young India Fellow at Ashoka University 2025-2026. And he was also awarded a full scholarship, 100% scholarship by Young India Fellowship, Ashoka University. Cyrus, I will now turn it to you to introduce our speaker of the day.
Thank you, Arnapal. Hello, everyone. I'd like to introduce Miss Pujita Guha to everybody. Miss Pujita Guha is currently a doctoral candidate at the Media Studies Department at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She is an artist, a curator, and academic. Her work hovers around questions of environment, media and aesthetics, and social justice. Over to you.
Hi everyone. I'm also actually so delighted just to hear what ARC is doing first and foremost, and also actually to see so many people turn up on a Zoom call to listen to me talk about forests on whichever Saturday evening, Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon, wherever people are. I don't actually have the fullest picture of the room. And also, over the last few months, I've also been hearing from Arnapal actually a lot of the great work consistently that ARC is trying to do. And I'm hoping that whenever I'm back in India, I actually also get to visit the place and get to hang around with everyone and so on. So actually, thank you so much for the invitation. I've also been following with some of the previous conversations. Um, Previous conversations within ARC's lecture series and so on. So before I get to do it before I start talking about about my own work and so on, um, I actually just want to say that it was actually quite a bit of a hard task trying to figure out what work I want to talk about. There's many facets of the work I do. Some bit of it is just curating for exhibitions. Some bit is actually working with different local art communities and researchers, and a lot of it is also academic and so on. But the one thing that I decided to kind of start off with is actually to talk about my love for forests and just to able to talk about how I observe forests, what I learn from them, and based on which my academic discipline, my training, my artistic work, and so on shape what I talk about the worlds and so on. Arnapal, I saw also had a forest Zoom background. I did not, as the main speaker of the event, but so be it. So what I'll do right now before we start and so on, I did have um, a bit of a small exercise we could do it. It is not necessary. Um, it is not absolutely necessary but I would be gracious if it would be gracious and would actually make for a lot of discussion if someone or few of you could actually take the initiative to do it. There's a QR code. If you are on your phone or if you have a separate phone, you can scan with it would be nice, but I'll also just drop a link on the chat myself. And what basically this thing involves, or this sort of thing that I'm exercise we can all do and take time to do it. And I've done it for different user a sort of different sort of online workshops, and I think it actually makes for a very good conversation later on, is actually for all of us to actually think about what is a forest. Much that we may have definitions about this place, I can guarantee that no two people think about it in same ways. Also, language shapes a lot of what we think about it as well. And I'll just paste the link. Language shapes a lot about what we think. For example, simply just the fact that, um, simply just the fact that my first language is Bengali, and the word for forest in Bengali is also actually what actually later transfers over to English, which is jungle or jungle in English. And the connotation of the word jungle actually just also has simply the connotation of being uncultivated land. It just means swampy, uncultivated land where you cannot do much. But when the word jungle itself moves over onto English, it has a very racialized connotation of being this land where there is abundant growth. It's a space of darkness, it's a space of barbarism, and it's the space in which primitive cultures reside, and so on. So the word jungle or forest has many different connotations. People experience it differently, and also people remember their visits to jungles or forests very differently. I can see Arnapal just talk about how this is from their visit recently in Hawaii, and so they're actually trying to conjure up their ideas of what a forest is, just simply through a Zoom background. We all relate to environments, we all relate to spaces through different media and cultural forms. Um, and what I'm hoping in, if you are actually on the taking on the QR code or the link here and filling in the responses, we can go over if people are doing it by the end. But that to me, often, I think the questions that I have put out in the space actually tells me a lot about what people are thinking about forests, and it actually has a lot of interest and opens up a lot of ways in which people think about these ideas. So before we get to do it, and we will come around to this by the end of my talk and so on, but I just actually wanted to talk with a very simple story in a way, and the story in a day in the life of me actually visiting a forest, and I'll slowly unpack what this visit was like, what the day went on like, and so on. But it tells me a lot as I reflect upon it, reflect back upon the day about how I think about forests and what my ways of thinking about the forest are in some way or the other. So I'll just start off with the story, and most of what I will talk through the rest of this next 30 minutes or so will just actually be how the day unfolds through the and day unfolds as I visit this place and so on. So this date is 5th March 2023. It's not very spectacular per se, but it tells me certain things that are to happen the rest of the day. So my friend Huing here and I were actually visiting this place in Northern Highland. And we decided to go on a van ride, and we wanted to go to an X place. I'll slowly reveal what that X place is. But what happened at the end in this sort of course of the day is that they had to actually attend to a Zoom call, that they were part of some reading group or something like that. And I'm assuming someone in the room is also actually on this Zoom call um, while while actually also traveling or in their car or something like that. So they were on their call, and they actually kept insisting on the with the driver that at some point we make a stop, because we were actually cutting through mountains and forests, and obviously there wasn't good signal for them to take on this call. So our driver, he found actually a bit of a resting spot that overlooks the hills at the bottom. So it's on the bit of a top of the hill, and found a bit of this edge on the edge of the hill to overlook the forest below. And we stopped the car. And you can imagine this place was about 100 square meters or so, this resting spot. It's often like when you're taking a hill ride or a mountain ride or you're hiking or something like that. It's where you stop and take photos of the sunset or something like that, right? So it's a bit of an edge of the forest, of the hill itself. So my friend Wing basically got invested into their Zoom call that they had to do, and I had nothing to do. So I stopped out of the car to see where we had stopped. So this is what the place opened up and looked like. So you could see the hills and the forests at the back, and there was a bit of a land clearing and so on from where they were doing the phone call inside. So this is what is going on for the next hour or so. So this is the description. But when I just stepped out of the car, I realized why actually our driver had stopped his car at that point is because he had actually seen this massive signals tower, like telecom tower, that had just been placed at the edge of the hill and so on. So he was like, where better than this to actually stop the car or park the car so my friend can take the call. There's actually so much clear signals, so much clear signal bandwidth here, and so on. And you can also see that in and around at the bottom actually that that there had been a bit of a clearing. That land had been cleared out, grasses had been cleared out, and the signal tower had been placed. I was doing this field work in 2023, so which is about 2 years ago. And then I realized when you go closer to the tower itself, that it was placed in 2021. So it's also not very old per se. And it was also placed by this company called TrueMove, which is like Thailand's one of Thailand's top three network companies and so on. So imagine like an Airtel tower or a Geo tower or whatever is your local reference wherever you are and so on. And so I realized that in one level you could see the presence of modern infrastructure in so-called forests, and that was actually of interest to me. If you look at this image, you see both the signal tower that's there. You can also see the electric lines and poles that are cutting through the forest. And also, if you can notice very closely, but it's not too visible, is that the actual main road is also there. So you can see the presence of modernity and the presence of modern infrastructure that we all take for very granted, the things that make our lives possible, actually very much present in the forest. And that actually suddenly had my interest, and so on. I'll come back to it also in a later sense. So this is me just observing the landscape as I'm going around and so on.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. And then basically I started walking around and seeing many other things in and around the landscape. One, for obviously, I started actually noticing the plants that were around me, and not microbial life, but insect life around me. More like my own. I'm not trained as a biologist and so on, but if nothing else, I have often these plant apps that help me recognize what plants they are, or animal apps that help me recognize what animals or insects they are. And so I was just going about observing the general part of the landscape. And if you are, I don't know again where most people are joining in from, but if you are from India's Northeast, you will find a lot of similarities to vegetation, to temperature, and even to height and distance, and so on, of these places. So we could see very common things that are also often very common in India's Northeast, like one being the charu grass, which you can see at the distance. That people use to make brooms and things like that. Banana being another very common plant, and then papaya and so on and so forth. And there were many different kinds of wild grasses and things like that. And bamboo being the other very common tree or plant and so on. So all of this is going on, and I'm walking around and I'm observing the landscape and things like that. Then, and my friend is actually taking the call in the car, and so on. Then suddenly, when I walk a bit, I notice something else that is happening right next and behind the van, and so on. So this is all happening in a matter of within 10-15 minutes as I'm observing. So what I see is that right next to where I was standing, um, that there had been a huge um, clearing of corn, basically. So what had happened is that there were young corn trees, that plants, sorry, not trees, plants that were growing. You can see that on the left image if you are noticing. And there were all these corn cobs that had been thrashed, which means that they had been cut off from the plant itself. And then if you know how corn is taken off, where you mean you take the cob off, or you take the covering off of the plant and the leaves and so on. And you could see a lot of these dried leaves and things like that on the right of the image. So the entire part of the where we had stopped for landing was actually just filled with this dried corn and things like that. And you could see the forest and the hills at the background, but at least in the foreground where I was standing, where the image is taken from, you could see this endless uh, clearing of corn and so on. It was a huge pile. But also along with the corn and the young whatever plants that are still remaining, and a lot of the old plants that have been thrashed and taken off and are just sort of withering away as residue. You also saw this, which was basically a hut or a couple of huts that had been growing, that had been built in the same spot. But what had happened is simply the fact that when I went in, there was nothing in there. They had been again broken down, decimated, and there was all kinds of cobwebs and so on and so forth. It really was not a hut or an architecture where anyone was living anymore. And beside the hut, you also saw a bit of all these plastic trash and things like that. And you can also see a few many jharu grasses in the image on the right. And so this is all happening within a very small space. So to say, where my car is, where our van is parked, where my friend is still doing the call, and so on and so forth. But what happens in the middle of observing all these things or noticing all these things within a very small space is that suddenly my camera heats up, the camera with which I'm taking all these photos, they all heat up suddenly, and then the camera stops working in the heat itself. And suddenly I'm made to realize that I'm also actually in the tropics in some way or the other, where my phone is overheating, my camera is overheating, and it also stops malfunctioning. The very method or very medium or the very technology with which I'm recording all these images also stops working in the heat itself. And it was actually quite hot, but about, I mean, it's not the hottest, but it would be about 34, 35 degrees centigrade and so on. So this is what happens within a space of 30 to 35 minutes as I'm walking around observing the landscape. And I see all these different things happening and so on, and the forest and the hills at the background as well. So my friend finishes the phone call, and then we sort of set sail for the next part of the day. I like to open this sort of way of talking about forests because it has an important connotation in my own work, and actually in the way in which I have titled today's talk as well, which is how to read a forest. And to me, this question about reading a forest is not the same as reading, for example, a piece of literature or a piece of poetry, uh, or even piece of any other text. You don't read a landscape necessarily, like your eyes don't scan left to right or top to bottom, like how we would read a text and so on. But what you do is, when you say that you're reading a forest, or when I say that I'm reading a forest, what I am fundamentally interested in is the act of observing a forest. What someone like anthropologists like Anna Singh, and I can give you all these references later on, we'll call the arts of noticing, right? That the forest is actually a very complicated space. There is so much diversity of plants, of vegetal, of insect life, so on and so forth. So how do you actually start noticing, first and foremost? And secondly, what does the noticing, what you are noticing, what you are observing tell you about the forest itself? Um, and what do you think what that forest is? So the elements that I noticed in this very light span of 30 to 35 minutes uh, was a signal tower, electric pole lines, a road. I saw corn being cultivated, corn that had also been thrashed and taken out. And I saw a broken hut, plastic bags. I saw different kinds of trees. You can also see a bit in the image as well. A lot of pan also grows in these landscapes. You also saw valleys, the geography of it, and ridges, and you saw different kinds of other things. And with my camera that stopped functioning in the heat and my phone and my camera overheating, I also realized that I'm also fundamentally actually dealing with heat and light in some way or the other. And what I realized most importantly is that I was actually not in what is called a pristine forest. I was actually most fundamentally, and that this I've highlighted in my second point, is that I'm actually in a human disturbed space, which means that when we think about forests, what often we are told and are taught is that forests are actually spaces of pristine preservation, that you go into a forest, for example, a natural park or a reserve, and things like that. And that is what you think what a forest are, that there are no humans in it, and that nothing is happening. It's just a space without humans. It's often just a space with just animals and microbial life and plants and things like that. So I realized that this forest has a lot of cultural presence. It has a lot of human presence. Some disturbance is very much governed from the top of the state, like in the sense of big money coming in. You can see things like the signal towers, the roads, and electric poles and things like that, where the state is developing these so-called backward spaces and so on in Northern Thailand. And on the other hand, you also see this idea of human disturbed spaces as sort of the last remains of perhaps farm workers or indigenous farm workers, I presume, just knowing the history, but I didn't meet anyone there, that they are also actually clearing out small patches of the forest and farming for themselves and living there and so on. Obviously, the idea of who is disturbing and which human is disturbing the forest is not the same. Uh, the presence of these huge scale road building projects or these huge scale signal towers project will have very different impact on the landscape than farmers clearing out small patches of land and farming in it for their own food and subsistence and so on. But what I also want to tell you is that when I talk about, or when I tell people that I am working and researching on forests, people automatically assume that I am a scientist for one reason or the other. It is presumed that the sciences have some upper hand in actually talking about environments and things like that. But as I visit forests of different kinds of different places, and so on, I realized that they are actually also very cultural spaces, in the sense that they are not only represented in culture for sure, but that there is human culture, there is human presence in forests all the time. And this is very much present through, in this case, with all these kinds of roads, electric poles, signal towers, and things like that, which means that people are actually coming here, building these things, or living there through farming and so on, and leaving the place and so on. So what I wanted to mention is that as I was picking up these different elements and also thinking through both the sort of big infrastructural kind of ideas, big infrastructural elements in the forest, and also the sort of farm life of farm workers in the forest, and also the natural elements in the sort of plants and vegetal life and insect life and things like that, I realized, and I'm continuously affirmed of this realization, is that what you observe about the forest tells you a lot of what the forest is or what you think a forest is, and so on, right? So for me to actually claim that the forest is a human disturbed space, that there are presence of many different human or cultural elements in the forest, I actually have to then apprehend or train myself to notice these things and so on. And I think the best way in which we all think how we go noticing about forests is, I always tell or like to joke with myself that you actually go about noticing a place with other people. And depending on what they are noticing and what you are noticing and what the similarities are and differences are of this noticing will tell you a lot about what you think what that place is and so on. When I often go with scientists and follow them for their research and things like that, I notice that they are obviously more interested in questions of how the natural world is working to them, whatever the larger sort of ecosystemic disturbances, climate change, global warming, bigger things that are happening, or deforestation, whatever. Their basic core of the study is that how it impacts or how it lives within plant or animal life. But I'm not a scientist, I'm a humanist. So fundamentally, I'm interested in how do actually human beings think about their relation to forests in one way or the other. So this is sort of a core example in which I like to often think about what my work is and think that the practice that I am fundamentally invested in is how I'm observing or reading a forest and what elements I pick up to tell what my story is in some way or the other. The one research or one sort of, I can give a lot many more resources if people are interested later on. But one of the things that I like to share, and I have actually learned a lot from, is this project that environmental historian William Cronon did when he was actually taking or teaching a class teaching a class on environmental history, which were at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and this was in 2008. And what he did is, as part of this larger research project, is to actually make this resource where people just put in different kinds of tips as to how they observe a landscape, and especially in this case, humanists observe landscape. But I think the research project also had social scientists and it also had natural scientists as well, all of whom who contributed in ways in which you can think about a landscape in many, many different ways. Some of which are as follows. Um, so, first of all, observe a landscape by walking and looking. There is no way in which one can actually orient oneself to a place without actually walking or immersing oneself in it and actually looking around and so on. Walking, I also think, is a very interesting thing that I like doing when I'm out into the forest and I'm sort of very attuned because it's in a way in which you think not from your head, but you sense the world from within your feet, right? And most people who are often very adroit, right? People who are sort of locals or natives, quote unquote, within a forest often just go around. I often joke about this, right? Like you can tell who an outsider is in a forest, given how thick their hiking boots are, and then the local or the native person will actually just walk around the forest um, or the mountains by just wearing sandals, right? Obviously, there is a class difference in this case, but somebody who is local to this place just knows which rock to skip, how to cross the river, where the tides are coming from, when the wind change, and things like that. Also, if you are interested in observing environments, one of the closest things is to observe questions of land use, right? Is the land being grown for crops? Is it for pasture? Is it a lawn? Or is it even a parking lot? Even a parking lot is a kind of a land use in some way or the other. Understand the seasons of it, for example, and what also William Cronon says, taste the landscape, right? Which means you don't have to actually taste the landscape. That's not what it is. But in a way, if you are interested in doing research on environments, then like just have the food that the landscape is producing and so on. I did not get a chance to have the corn because there was no fresh corn left for me to taste. But yes, part of that understanding of the environment or that forest will actually be to taste the food in which it is grown and so on. There are many, many, many infinitely long points, which I also think are very good tips in ways to remind oneself on how to observe landscapes. And it comes from many different positions, comes from political positions, comes from identity positions, and many different layers and subsections one can go into it. I don't have the time, but you can take the resource as is. The other thing that William Cronon says, or at least that guidebook or handbook says, is that read landscapes from the perspective of representation, right? So how has the landscape actually been represented and put out in different media forms? That to me is a core of my existence, you could say. And I think about this question very, very seriously and many different levels. And that, most importantly, is that land or environments have a history. What you see necessarily may not be the case, or that where what you see in the present has a past to it and has arrived at it, and so on. Right? So these are some of the 2 points that I will just take up and analyze and talk through in the next 10 minutes or so, and then we will wind down in some way or the other. But these are just 2 points I took out from a long list of points that Cronon mentions in that link. So where were we actually going that day on 5th March 2023? So we were actually at this place called Mae Salong in Northern Thailand. Mae Salong is a small district. I'll show you the map in a second. But it is in Northern Thailand and very close to the borders, close to Myanmar or Burma. And where we were actually going is called the Martyrs Memorial Hall, and in this village called Shantikiri. And or in if you have guessed the word, it also means peace village in some way or the other. Now, what this building is that you see now, so we were on the top of the hills, and then we came down at the valley inside the forest. Is that what we are seeing up in front is the Martyrs Memorial Hall. And the Martyrs Memorial Hall is basically where the Kuomintang or KMT used to have their headquarters in Northern Thailand. So who or what is Kuomintang? I don't know if everyone will be familiar, but I'll just give a 2-minute recollection of them. So Kuomintang are, you can say, a nationalist army that grew out of, or in response, or at the same time during Mao Zedong's rise in People's Republic of China. And what happened is, as you can say, a paramilitary organization, a revolutionary organization, or nationalist organization, whatever bracket of terms one wants to associate with the Kuomintang, one part of Kuomintang went over and established Taiwan as we know it through many different hierarchical processes and so on and so forth. I'm not going into that history. But what is important to me is that a part of Kuomintang came from southwest China to northern Thailand to actually when they had to flee, sorry, when they were forced to leave China, and then when they fled and came to northern Thailand to this very village where they were re-establishing their army, their headquarters in Southeast Asia. The Kuomintang or the KMT history was important because in a way, through from the late 40s to the early 80s, they actually organized in a way in which and became an influential political force in the region, especially in Thailand, as ways to accrue money, get money, and to arm themselves in a way to then continuously try and move back to or attack China from the southwest end. So actually to take control back of China was their ultimate goal in one way or the other. And in part of doing so, and in part of KMT's own history, one of the ways in which that they actually were managing to do this, before I get one of the ways in which that they were trying to do so is actually through opium cultivation, and I'll get that to a second. But this is just to give a larger map in which this entire history is panning out. So most of the KMT members or Kuomintang members who came in from down south from the 1940s when Mao actually took over mainland China, PRC at least, is actually they all came in from this province called Yunnan. And again, a very similarly mountainous area occupied by many different indigenous communities who also sometimes fled during this time. And then they came and settled here at Mesa Long, but not directly. There are many steps and many histories. But at least where I was, it's in the place in the red that you can see, the Martyrs Memorial Hall in Mesa Long, which is very close to the Burma border. And you can also see the larger regional context in which all of this is happening. So this is the most westernmost context would be India's northeast, and then it would also go on to parts of Laos and parts of Vietnam, which also have very similar histories of of being indigenously occupied and also having different relations to their nation states and things like that. Anyway, but the thing is that where we were going there, where we were there, it is actually this place in the red that I was visiting, and which the history of the forest you see in one way or the other. Right. So suddenly, from actually just observing corn and signal towers and things like that, and being in this sort of memorial hall or this mausoleum, that I actually are able to tell you a larger history of the conception of the region and of the state in some way. But what happened in the 1980s or like late 1970s, the Kuomintang, especially in Southeast Asia or in Thailand, did not actually get the money, or at least did not have the political capacity to actually reoccupy China. So ultimately, in the early 1980s, they what they call very famously hung up their boots, which means that they gave up on arms and then actually moved to a different history or a historical trajectory. I'll come to it in a second. But this place since then has become a museum, you can say, a memorial hall for actually thinking, which sort of a museum hall recollecting the history of the Kuomintang and the history of the forests of the region. Now, since I had mentioned that to me, thinking about how land is represented and how forests are represented are central, I saw this sort of question come up very centrally also in the museum itself. So, in the center of this museum or mausoleum or memorial hall, whatever, you see this large posters and banners of images of the KMT doing different kinds of military activities through different parts of their history. You see it how you will see it any museum, right? But then, and I'm not going into all the details, but then in the foreground, one sees actually what would be called a geographic model, right? That people make in schools or you see in your libraries or geography or natural history museums and things like that, that you see actually a sort of a miniature model of the landscape in which the same landscape in which I was showing you the Google images about, right? So it's a geographic model that tells you the different places in which Kuomintang was actually moving about. So this is some of the close-up shots in which and it's a huge model. I mean, there's no way in which one could take an entire image of it. And it would also not give you the details. But if one looks closer, the same Google Earth image kind of representation of the region, you see it from a different position or an angle here. What you see here is not just the landscape being represented. You obviously see parts of green, which means forest. You see ridges, you see mountains and things like that. But what was interesting to me is that because I am in the KMT museum, because I am in this place that fundamentally is about the history of this paramilitary force or this revolutionary army, is that they think about the forest only as a place of military strategy and a place of military operations, right? To them, the green is important, but to them, what is really important are all the threads that they mark out in red. The places of red or the threads of the red are important, which means the places in which the army is moving, where they do their guerrilla attacks, the yellow points would mean where they stop and rest, and the red flags would mean what they are conquering and things like that, right? So how a forest, the same forest or the same region that I am now thinking only in terms of signal infrastructure, that I am now thinking about corn, I am now thinking about different jharu and bamboo and things like that. For the KMT, that very idea of the space is very different to them. To them, it's a question of how do you actually move through the place very deftly, very quickly, and things like that. So what I'm trying to fundamentally get at is that when one thinks about forest, one is automatically thinking about how the forest is represented, in this case, in this kind of geographic representation, for sure, very basic. But it also tells you whose representation are we talking about, right? So my idea of representing the forest will matter very significantly and very differently from the KMT and their representation of the same region. But lastly, the thing that happened is that, and what Cronin um is talking about, is the sense of the land having its own history, right? And how do you observe it in the land? There's no way per se of saying understanding it. So one thing that I realized while being in the museum is that, and I don't have a lot more pictures of the museum because my camera was already very dead at that point. But what I realized is that, and I knew about this somewhat, is that that entire region and the way in which, as I was mentioning prior, the way in which KMT accrued or got a lot of money to continue their operations from the 40s to the 70s was actually massive opium production in the across the region. So Mesa Long actually became, in slight way or the other, the heroin capital of Asia at some point, or Southeast Asia for sure. Um, and what happened is, slowly after KMT hung up their boots in the 1980s, what ended up happening is that these entire lands were taken up by the government, or also by often other displaced descendants of the KMT leaders, their workers, a lot of them who had come down from China, Southwest China. And what happened is, through many different kinds of developmental programs and things like that, the entire region were transformed from being major opium production centers to now, which I write about, a history of tea and coffee production in some way. And so when I looked at these sort of rows and rows of tea farms, and also just having visited the the KMT museum, and seeing actually all these images on the land and so on and so forth, um, is that I saw, in a way, that the history of the opium that the museum is talking about has given way to actually tea production in the present. And this entire region itself has gone through uh, a lot of change, right? So just to kind of summarize and pull us back in, is that one thing that I kind of try and go back all the time in my own research, but also just going through the example of visiting the museum, of visiting the forest, and visiting the museum in the forest, is that I'm always invested in how landscapes or environments are represented in different kinds of media, and whose representation are we talking about, what does that representation involve, and things like that, right? So a representation in terms of within science or science images will be very different when thinking about representation when it comes to, for example, in folk tales and songs, will be very different when it comes to cinema and things like that, right? So that is one question that I think about. But I also think about that if you have to attend to this question of representation of landscapes, one also can start from actually seeing what's happening in the landscapes themselves. And landscapes or environments themselves will have a lot of stories to tell, one way or the other. And then the other way in which what is important is to always recognize that any environment has a history to it. It need not be always a history that you think of only in terms of natural history, which means thinking in terms definitely in hundreds and thousands of years when you think about forest, or at least hundreds of years when one thinks about the life of trees in tropical forests and so on. But it can be very recent history also. The history that I'm talking about of the forests and of these lands that are transitioning uh, are from the Cold War, which means from the late 1940s to the present and so on. But it is important to recognize in some way that all land has history, and even human history and cultural history that is informing it. So just to kind of go back to why I'm telling the story, right? And what this day that involves this 5th March, the day of visiting the museum and seeing the forest and everything tells me, right? So fundamentally, in one way or the other, I'm interested in what stories we tell about forest, right? So for my version of telling the story, we'll have all these histories in ways in which other people's histories may not, or tellings of the forest may not have, right? How we tell what we tell, right? So questions of representation, questions of media, questions of identity are very important, right? So for long, I'm telling you about the history or the identity of the Kuomintang, right? So their version of how they think about the forest will be very certain, and they will represent it in very certain ways. And then questions about language. This I didn't get to touch upon a lot, but if you are on the Google sheet, you will see that the question of language is very important, right? And for everyone, for whatever perspective you are telling the story about the forest and how you are observing the forest, and also how you're observing media forms and representations of the forest, will tell you what a forest is, right? So the ways in which you assemble your protagonists of the story will change the story itself, and excuse me, what you think about the forest in some way or the other. And what I am always invested in is this idea of how forests themselves go so much change through different kinds of political activity that's in it, right? And the same forest, which is at one part an opium, major production of opium in the world, at some way has now become a slightly different kind of major production of tea and coffee in the region, and so on, which also will have different kinds of um, ecological fallout or ecological benefits or whatever, right? And it also will have its political differences and so on and so forth. But most importantly, it tells me and reminds me that there is nothing about imagining that the forest is a pristine space where there are no humans involved. There are humans present who are in very different scales and very different political orders, changing what we think what a forest is. And lastly, and this goes back to, not goes back, but goes into what I've been touching about, is that I am, and this is something that just comes from my own training in media studies, but this is something I'm not too invested necessarily, but it comes necessarily as who I've become in a slight sense, is that media shapes our knowledge of environments, right? What we know of the world necessarily comes through media, could be these days social media and scrolling through our phones, or the Zoom call also as a media form, or even a telescope as a media, which you can think of a telescope as a camera, right? Or whatever, a form of lens in some way or the other. So what I'm trying to get at is that media is very important, and this I'm something I'm always very, very conscious of, is that shapes how we think of what we know of environments. And this is very important to me, and so on. And just to go back to how the day began, there is media in every part of the story that I have told you. So you can think about both the models in the forest in one way. There is Google Earth images. There is Huing, who is using a computer, who is using images in one way to talk about it, whatever their call is. And also, most importantly, there are signal towers, right? They are not media, but they're media infrastructure, in the sense that without a signal tower, there will be no social media for you to use, right? They are the back end. They are what make possible what we consume through internet and so on and so forth. So there is media through every part of the story, as I've told you. But most importantly, to me, there is also my camera that is actually documenting the landscape, documenting the museum, and is actually through these images telling you the story that I am telling you now, right? So there is media that shapes every part of this last 30 to 40 minutes of the story that I have told you about my one day of visiting this one very small place in Northern Thailand, in really in the middle of nowhere. But there is media that fundamentally shapes how I think about a place, how I document it, how I'm telling you the story. And also there is media in the landscape in and of itself. So media to me becomes the core thing in which I observe landscapes in some way or the other. So then just the last minute to go on here, right? I am interested fundamentally to summarize basically in this question on how to read a forest. So how to, which means it's a question about political or scientific perspectives or frameworks, and also actually just sometimes the media technologies, right? That help us in the second part observe landscape, make sense of landscape. That is, how do I tell the story that I want to tell? How do I observe the story, the world in which I want to tell? And then think about what is a forest, right? So forest, again, may be very different things to everyone, but at least in this case, it's a question of dense vegetation. It's a question of uncultivable land, things like that. So yeah, so I think this is generally going back to everything that I do is actually foundational to how I work and exist in the world in some way or the other. So yeah, thank you. We can go back to some discussions and things like that now. I'm looking forward to questions, or we can look at the Google Sheet too. But thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Pujita. Thank you so much. That was really brilliant. And also for laying out the framework of your research and how we do media research in a very different context, like a forest, right? I mean, personally speaking, I know of media research in the context of popular culture or mainstream media or new media for that matter, but to have this kind of research is a very different orientation altogether. So I request our audience, if you have questions, you can use the raise hand feature. Also, you can use a chat box to uh, drop your questions, comments. But before people, while people are taking time to do so, I have a couple of questions, Purita. Um, one, I'm sure you must have engaged with this concepts of the colonial, the colonial conceptualization of land as terra incognita. You know, I was also thinking of that on one hand, and on the other hand the indigenous, one of the philosophies of indigenous studies or indigeneity is the land-based pedagogy, right? Land with land, we have this interdependence. We have this not just cultural, but also deeply cultural and spiritual and kind of reciprocal relationship, right? We have with the land. Where does this too? Because whenever we talk about land, we always critique this colonial conceptualization that has led to mass colonization across whatever 600 years. And then on the other hand, this very strong, very radical indigenous conceptualization of the land. Where do these two fit in? And although you didn't touch upon this thing, but somehow, that's number one. Number two, I really like this idea of very fascinating. This idea of the from opium cultivation to tea and coffee. Because usually we would think that it would be a transition from tea and coffee to opium. I mean, I have very limited knowledge on this because opium is considered like more lucrative. And how were they able to, manage this transition from opium to tea production after the KMT's whatever departure in the 80s? Was it in the 80s? Yeah. If you know a little bit of history, if you can share that, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mesnam. Thank you for the question. So, just to answer the first one first, let me pull up actually the two things I would just mention. First is just the fact that hold on. Let me talk through just to these two images first. So when I am visiting and walking the forest, or at least where my car has parked for this 30 minutes or 1 hour or whatever, is that I actually see the corn and the plants uh, that are growing in the place. And here I see the broken hearts and the plastics and things like that, right? So what happens is, what I'm trying to fundamentally get at is that at that moment, I may not see people necessarily in their physical presence, like in their physical flesh and body at the moment, but people exist. Which mean, and what I am seeing is actually the afterlife of an agricultural season having gone past. So people have farmed, and these are nomadic people. This is, you can understand slightly from knowing the region and so on, that they are nomadic farm workers. So they will just come and farm on that corn, grow corn, which would be about 2 3 months, farm in and around the region and leave, right? And so even though I'm not seeing physical human bodies in front of me, apart from my friend and the driver and so on. I'm seeing social presence. Like I am seeing the presence of indigenous communities through the ways in which they farm, what they do, and have nomadic architecture and things like that. So this is a question I always think about in one way or the other. That, and this is like a baseline, that there is no terra incognito in my world. That is the fundamental baseline, right? And therefore also, in if people have, I can pull up, but if people have the worksheet, for example, there was one question, which is I'll just show this question. And I think this goes back also to the first question, is that to your first point, Maisna, which is, does your imagination of forest have people? If yes, then who? To me, this is again a fundamental question. When you think about the forest, do you think about it as a walk with your grandfather? That can also be one way of relating to the forest. Um, or do you think about as military presence, given wherever your regional history is, or things like that, or whatever, right? So this question is, I didn't actually even ask if no, right? For me, it's a question that if yes, then who, right? And then you can think about who you're relating the forest with, or which other human presence you're relating the forest with. So I boil it down to very simple questions, but they come from these questions about terra incognito and things like that. And then the second question is that, so then it's a follow-up question that, um, if the land is not a terra incognito, which means that the land has people, uh, then how are they thinking about the land in some way or the other, right? So it's a how should I say? Almost in my head, and many people have said so. It's almost a consequential thought. Like if yes, so the step first is yes, the land has people, right? And land has, especially in these contexts, indigenous communities and so on. And so therefore, from there on, I mean, I didn't get to touch it so much in this context because here I was just talking about more like environmental observation as a core practice, and how that opens up. But in the long, in sort of my longer work, I write a lot about different indigenous communities of this region who think about the land in one way or the other, right? So the follow-up question, even when I'm observing the corn, will be that yeah, will simply be that like, are they doing multi-cropping? That's one way in which you can think about ways in which indigenous communities have their land-based pedagogy, like in the sense that the land will tell you which crops to have at what seasons, at what cycles of the year. For example, it will also tell you, looking at the landscape, and also talking to people if you have people around you, is that, for example, which slope to even farm on, right? Like communities will know that this is the south facing side or north facing side of the mountain. So burn down the forest here, cultivate it for the next 10 years, and then move on, or something like that, right? So then just knowing that the land has much to tell itself will bring you to the question of land-based knowledges and things like that. This is something I write in a longer versions of the talk and so on. The idea about the KMT and the opium, coffee to opium production, just quickly to say, the thing is, what happened is after KMT hung up their boots, but it's not just that the KMT hung up their boots. There were many different things happening in Thailand, but especially what happened is that the Thai state was like, we no longer want opium to be growing in Thailand, for many different historical reasons. But what happened is, because the state was so invested in eradicating opium, uh, that they actually started sponsoring all these highland developmental projects funded by the government, where the Thai monarchy will actually go, uh, and this is from a different presentation, just to clarify, that the king would go and actually introduce crops, um, especially tea and coffee, to the highland communities and so on, the indigenous communities. This is a very famous image of the king introducing coffee to a Hmong village in northern Thailand and so on. So there's an entire history about how these developmental projects from the state force, you can say, communities to give up, in a way, indigenous way to give up both indigenous ways of life, but also opium production and then become farmers within coffee world and things like that. Yeah. So yeah. Anyway, I see one few questions. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, shall I read out a question?
Yeah, you can, yeah.
Yeah, this one is from Sukanya Mohan. Hello, Pujita. I was thinking about reading the forests that are no more there. In many folk narratives, there is a reference to forests that used to be there, where these ghosts or folkloric figures are set. We can read these forests through oral history still. I feel there is so much politics there that represents a kind of lost histories within God. As these narratives evolve and come to digital media, the forest is exiting these narratives as well. How do you see this phenomenon?
It's a very good question and a very complicated one, actually, to answer and so on. So I'll try my best, but I don't think I have all the answers for it, but I'll think I can say my best to it. Um, part of part of thinking about forests that are no more, part of me is also always like, I can always talk about forests that are no more, but personally I still like to talk about forests that are still there. And I say this because that actually, I don't know if it gives people the hope or anything like that. I'm not naive that way, but in a sense that I also just don't want to lament that all forests are gone and all forests have been deforested and so on. People and activist communities, indigenous communities are still resisting and fighting to keep their forests day in and day out. So I just one basic clarifying thought. But that not obviously to say that forests are there as much as they used to be historically and so on. I'm aware that deforestation happens very much. But the thing is that in talking about folk narratives and folk tales and things like that, there's many ways in which all of this goes about. One way is that these folk narratives and folk tales, obviously, especially through mythologies and things like that, will tell you histories about will tell you all these histories and narratives of the forest and things like that. And I'm interested. I've written a lot on these questions of mythology and what they tell you about human relations to the forest and so on. Sometimes it's a scary place, sometimes it's a welcoming place, sometimes it's a place of gods, things like that. There's many ways in which all of this goes on, but it depends slightly in which all of these narratives come back in the present, and I think this is what you're trying to get at. And one of the ways in which I see all this happening, and I write a bit about it, is also actually the living root bridges in Meghalaya, which a lot of you might be familiar with, where Khasis build these bridges using the roots of the rubber plant. I don't know if some of you have visited or not and so on, right? But the interesting thing is that on one hand, and this is caught in this exact sort of dichotomy that you are telling me, is that on one hand, there is a revival of indigenous design and indigenous thinking and things like that. But what is also happening consequently is that with the state, that there is a boom for ecotourism in many places in Meghalaya, which means that consequently there is also, even as these narratives become center stage, people are publishing all these books, and there is so much state funding on digitizing oral history projects and so on and so forth, especially around the root bridges. That it's promoting an ecotourist industry, which is actually also killing the forest in some way or the other. So there is always a sort of cunning of recognition, like, oh, like, will this generate, will this folktale also generate money for the state or not, is the problem sometimes. So folktales get revived, but then there can be actual dangers of ecological harm and so on. And many Khasi activists have also written about this and so on, that there's a danger actually in some way of this overemphasis on the root bridges and their folk tales and things like that. Yeah, I don't know if it's a long answer, but I think that it's a anyway. Okay, see another thing. From my experience, people in India are actually scared to visit areas with forest as they think it's an area filled with illegal activities. Most of the time, it's through trekkers and climbers, the experiences of forest are passed on. How do you think this fear can be changed? Good question. And actually, I think it's also very autobiographical in a way. I also used to be a bit scared. One is always a bit scared about what the forest is. And why this scare is exists, one can also understand it as like for many different reasons. I'll come to it separately. But I think I have an answer to it slightly, which is that once a Filipino friend once told me that in Filipino cultures, when they have to enter a forest, they do this thing called tabu-tabu po, tabi-tabi po, which means you just touch the ground and then touch yourself and just tell yourself that you're bowing down to the spirits of the forest, and then you just enter and walk in, and which means that once you have appeased the gods of the forest, that they are welcoming you in the place and so on. So I think if they were pulling my leg, actually in a way they were teasing me that why are you so scared of forest and so on. So once I did it and walked in and started doing it, I was like, nothing happens. There's a history in which this fear is manufactured and you're told to be afraid of forests and things like that. But the important thing about Tabi-Tabi-Po is that if you appease to the gods, and this I'm very sure of, you have to leave the forest by the night. Then the spirits come alive. And so this my fear still exists about the night in the forest. But other than that, once I have appeased to the gods uh, and the spirits, I'm fine. There's nothing illegal about it.
We have another question, which is
Mm,
slightly different from what do you have to say about the forests of central India, which have been turned into militarized zones?
mm.
Also, can I add something? The forest that you went to in these border areas in Southeast Asia, what like did you also come across like militarized areas? And did you have access to that? If you could share some stories, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's one thing to think about it, and I'll say the short answer to you first, and then the longer answer to the question on the chat. Um, the shorter answer is yes. Even this region is entirely militarized and heavily militarized. I write a lot about military occupations in forests. Again, something I did not get to touch here. But just simply by the fact that I'm going into a museum of a former military base, a former huge, one of the largest military organizations in the world, means that the state has now taken over the entire place. And state, there's heavy, like if you go, there's like always checkpoints you have to cross. There's always like um, border patrol, how do you say, yeah, royal border force in Thailand, moving about in jeeps and vans and things like that. Even if necessarily this place, like the museum itself, does not have military presence and so on. So these are heavily militarized places and things like that. And there's also a history in which, and I write about this also very concretely in my dissertation, that this other village where I do actual field work in and write about uh, that communities were moved from their ancestral forest lands literally at gunpoint and forced to settle and take up tea and coffee farming over the many years and things like that. So the military is very much present, and also Thailand is a military dictatorship very directly, and a very heavy military presence in the indigenous lands and forest lands and so on. So yeah, in terms of military occupation in central India and so on. So one thing I'll just like to say is that I'm not the regional or political expert, so to say, but I'll just concretely point to one thing, which is that. Which is that, again, this is again a very similar repetition that we see in Southeast Asia, in India's northeast, and also in central India, that indigenously occupied land gets taken over by military forces, and have been taken over by military forces since the very conception of the modern Indian nation state, even before, but definitely after, and so on. And there's one thing to remember in all of this is that what we define actually as forest in this sort of idea of a national park or reserve, um, and whatever, a pristine forest. And Bengalis love to talk about Shalbon, which is all these teak forests and God knows what. Is that actually that the area of the forest has been created because they were militarized, that they actually did not exist as separate forests uh, from civilized places and things like that. People, indigenous communities have always lived in forests. And have always cultivated within forests in small patches or the other, and so on. And then used to commute, let's call it commute, to more civilized places for trade and this and that and so on and so forth. The very idea that of what we think a forest is actually often a militarized definition, that there is no forest actually that is not created out of the military defining what a forest is as a national park, a reserve, and things like that. So if you are asking that forests of central India, which have been turned into militarized zones, I'll actually flip it and say is that militarized zones actually create forests in some way or the other. That is actually the history in some way in thinking about forests and so on. Yeah.
Right. We have a couple of minutes. We can still take questions. Uh,
I'm curious to see some responses here also.
we're
I
Yeah. Go
I,
on. Go on.
not a question, but more of a comment. As I was, listening to your presentation, I was, it reminded me of my time in Goa and how instructor instructed us to be really aware of the animals and also, potential harms. And, it really, concerned me and it worried me more than before entering the forest. So I am piecing it all together. I do feel that forest is this sort of an entity that that has created that creates a certain sense of mystery in us.
Yeah, yeah, totally, totally. I mean, we've all grown up with folk tales, if nothing else. I mean, there's many examples I can give, but if nothing else, even a simple one as Hansel and Gretel, right? This is nothing to do with Asian folk tales. It's the most European folk tale ever. But even in Hansel or Gretel, the danger is always in the forest. The witch always lives in the forest. Um, versus the cultivation land where the communities stay and farm and things like that. Or even in Red Riding Hood, right? Like the evil or the danger of the wolf mother or whatever the creature is always in the forest and so on. So the forest is in some ways always created as the opposite of where settlement is, where human life is, um, and so on. And I think even for me, even I mean, I'm not the best again to know, and I never often travel alone in forest. Is that to actually give in to someone who knows the forest better than you, and there will be someone around you who knows the forest better than you, and so on. So whether that's animal, whether that's whatever, how the wind moves or how the light moves, whatever, you will find some elderly person, if no one, nothing else, who knows the forest. And I think that is important to recognize native knowledge or land-based pedagogy, but actually just native knowledge fundamentally, even when you're visiting the forest, is crucial. Yeah. Thank you so
Pulita,
much.
Pulita, if I may, very okay. We have one more. Uh, or somebody. Okay, Jobish has a question. Sometimes forests are featured more as non-representational in films. I mean, merely as a given area for human activities. How can one read this phenomenon? Yeah.
It's actually a very core film and media studies question. And film and media studies scholars spend endless hours debating these things. Um, I will say this, that the forest need not be the protagonist of the film, but if it is set in the forest, even if it is mere backdrop or something like that, it will still have an influence in the way in which the film is set, it is shot, how the characters are set, and so on. There is no idea of, or at least within the humanities, at least, or environmental concerns within the humanities, is that there is no mere backdrop in that sense. That it may not be the most important thing in the film, that there is something else happening, maybe a romance, maybe some feudal drama, some whatever your genre is. But nevertheless, it will still have an impact in ways in which you think about the film and so on. So I often also write about these kinds of things as well, the forest in the film, and even when the forest is not so present, it is important and so on. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Purita. I have a really fundamental question here. So, one, it could be one of your dissertation defense questions as well. Why you chose these areas, these particular geographies to conduct your to conduct this particular research? Why not elsewhere? And that's number one. And also, how did you reach out to I mean, you have friends and colleagues and local guides accompanying you. So, because you, and on the other hand, you also described some of these places were erstwhile, militarized or the state or the army controlling it and control in many ways even today. So, how do you get access to those, those checks? Yeah. So, if you could just share a bit. Yeah. Because I'm sure there are other people who like to do similar kind of research, so this could be like really
Yeah, useful.
beneficial.
Yeah. So, how did I send up? Actually, through cinema, in a way. I am a film and media scholar, and that is my ancestral origin, let's call it. And actually, a lot of the Thai filmmakers of the early 2000s were actually shooting um, and talking about a lot of folk cultures and folk mythologies of the forest, and also under militarized rule and things like that. One very famous filmmaker, I'll write his name out, Apichat Pong. Apichat Pong Veerasatipul, is a famous enough filmmaker whose films are always shot in the forest. So I think it began as a question of seeing these films and getting interested in it, that I started asking more questions about the forest in some way or the other. And that took me to these places. And in terms of getting access, and so I think that opened up the region in one way or the other. Then I read other books and things like that. One famous book that I often refer to is James Scott, Art of Not Being Governed, which is telling the history of how indigenous communities in the forest hills have always resisted the state, have always flown away from the state, and so on. So, all these books and all these references, especially the films early on, were very important to me. And I got interested in the history of the forests in some way, and some way or the other. And then later on, I was interested in terms of like sort of network building and things like that. In this case, when I was doing research, I actually have been researching more distantly from the archives and looking at films and things like that on opium and coffee and things like that. And then when I was more sort of, when I realized a close friend enough of mine, Huing, when they were also doing, or when they were interested in this research, and they have actually been doing um, research on in northern Thailand for very long, about like a decade now, that I decided to simply follow them and sort of figured out our connections from there on, and so on. So in a way, whenever one goes into the field to do field work, one is always latching on from existing networks and things like that. And that also depends slightly on access to militarized zones or things like that, right? Like who leads you? It's almost like doing journalism, right? Like you have a source and then they point out to another source and so on and so forth. And then if I don't know anyone at all, then I just go to the museums actually, or go to public spaces and observe the landscape. And I emphasize on this because not all the time, even when I am doing field work, that I have access necessarily. When I don't have access to anything, I remember doing all this field work also in Meghalaya on the root bridges, and I knew no one for a few weeks at all in this village, and I would just actually go to the middle of like every village has like a tea stall, right? That is the public space for the village, right? People come to drink tea or whatever, smoke a bidi or something in the evening, and then I will just go and sit and draw sketches or like write something or something or the other and start chatting up with people actually. So it's when I don't have any access to any people per se, I just will do very shameless things like that, which is just go up and talk to people in a common space. And if you are drawing or some trick like that, then people, Indians or Asians, they are very curious and nosy. They will start looking at your notebook and start asking you, and then you are laying the trap, and then they fall into it. So, I've done it.
Yeah. Yeah. One very short, quick question before I take up the next one. What about the language barrier? You were in Thailand. Did you know the language or
Yeah, so when I was doing this field work, so this one day I did not have a translator. So I've had a Thai translator, but I have very bare functional knowledge of Chinese, and a lot of this history is Chinese. And a lot of communities I work, also the Akha community, whose work is the longer work that I do, they are also descendants from Yunnan as well, who came down south from China. So they are also Sinophone in that sense. They speak Chinese. And so that helps me a lot, but I also have for um professional translators sometimes and things like that. Yeah, yeah. Mm.
so Tongumba, who is from ARC, he has a question. Thanks, Pujita. Great presentation. As someone from a community who considers forest as a sacred land and celebrate forest gods. So he's basically talking about a Meitei community. We have this annual ritual called Lai Harauba, which is basically propitiating or pleasing the gods. So the gods. So in the Meitei like indigenous religion, so the gods are basically the forest, right? They reside in the forest, and we invoke them from time to time and do all these rituals and dance and music to please them. So he's asking that I'm curious, do other global traditions outside Southeast Asia link the sanctity of forests to religious or spiritual figures, and how has this impacted forest preservation?
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, it's a great question. The most well-cited example is actually that of Ecuador, um, and the different Amazonian indigenous groups who live in the forest there. I'll paste a link or two about the actual movement, but I'll just say it quickly. Um, is simply just the fact that uh, it is not in Ecuador or other Amazonian cultures that they necessarily think the sanctity of the forest is in actually religious or spiritual figures, but that they are actually profane figures in the sense that they are actually your relatives and cousins and things like that, that they're descendants with whom you actually share family ties and kinship with, and that they're actually humans with a form of another tree or something like that. Uh, so what that has done, especially in the case of Ecuador, is that it has actually used, and what a lot of indigenous activists have used in a very clever way. I actually think it's also very clever legal work or jurisprudence, one can call it, is to actually use human rights in that logic to actually affect forest preservation. So if you think that the forest is many different human beings, then the forest also deserves human rights in some way or the other. So it's not the same as preserving the sanctity of the forest through spirituality, but actually the opposite of spirituality, which is profanity, that you think that they are also your relatives, your cousins, and they are in the same world as you. And they are also humans, and they have spirits and souls and think or whatever. And so they are other humans in other shape and form. And if they are humans in other shape and form, they deserve human rights in the legality of it. So actually, people have used, and indigenous communities have used this indigenous cosmology, but have used it within Western jurisprudence of thinking of using human rights and things like that. So I think that's a very famous case study and example where this has worked out very clearly. Yeah.
Can you also, if you don't mind, if you can post a link or two or a demo
Yeah,
of a
yeah, I
book
will. I
that,
was just going to do
uh,
that. I didn't
yeah,
have it at hand, but
yeah, uh,
I will.
yeah. If I'm not wrong, in the meantime, I think a couple of years ago, was it the Supreme Court of India or the Uttarakhand High Court? I forgot. They also declared certain river as having human rights because I don't know which group was that. They claim that the river is their human relative and so on and so forth. So I don't know. I forgot. I can Google it right now, but it was the Supreme Court of India or some High Court who declared the river as having human rights. So there was a very clever way of
Yeah,
doing this kind of
yeah.
advocacy. Yeah.
Yeah, and also I will say I mean, at least I won't use the word Indian, but definitely the problem in our case is that we have personified in all our Hindu cosmology, everything is personified. Even a river is some lady god, yeah, Ganges
Hmm.
or whatever. Brahmaputra is a male god, whatever, right? Everything is personified, but then people don't have the political will to then reserve the personified entity, except the cow. The cow is the only actual sacred entity in this country.
Hmm.
Everything
Hmm.
else is profane and can be destroyed, and so on. No, truly.
Hmm.
I'm just figuring out a link or something like that. Give me 1 second.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, in the meantime, if people have questions, comments, we have uh, and what Pujita presented is just a fragment of our work. It's part of a much larger dissertation and a book project. Uh, Cyrus, Tongumba, and others, do you have any question?
No more questions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this should be it. 1 second. Right. End the awkward silence myself.
Mm-hmm. No, it's fine. Absolutely. I mean, this is for everyone. It's called Rights
The link
and
to the Ecuador passes this new
uh-huh.
law about
Mm-hmm.
fraud. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is okay. I'm gonna yeah. Well, Pujita, any last comment before we wind up?
No, I'm very thankful actually, just to repeat myself. I'm very, very thankful that you gave me the opportunity and invited me, and then we can keep talking otherwise. And I'm actually very thankful also to people who responded. I'm looking at the responses now, and I'll pass it along in my time.
Yeah, and I did respond too, by the
Yes,
way.
I know.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Pujita. Thank you so much for the brilliant presentation. I'm sure everyone learned a lot. And for those people who wanted to do similar kind of research, look up Pujita's work. You can always reach out to her. I can share her email address with you later on. She's also kindly shared some of the books and authors and links, which we can use to further the conversation. And Pujita, looking forward to uh, yeah, reading more of your works and interacting with you again. So
Thank
yeah.
you so much. Thank you so much, everyone.
All right. Bye, everyone. Good
Bye-bye.
night. Good day,
Bye.
wherever you are.
Bye-bye.